So we're going to talk about the chapter 4, which is the institutionalization of business ethics. And as with so much this semester, I'm gonna drill down on some of the stuff that's near and dear to me. In this case, though, I'm gonna focus on something in the textbook, and I'm gonna clarify a lot because I think the way the book discusses something is really very confusing. So I'm gonna explain the way that I want to explain it, and we'll go there. And let's see, and then let me see here. Controls. Yes, that's what I wanted. Although, thank you as always, Trevor, for helping admit people. I really appreciate that.
Not a big deal.
Thanks. So, namely, we're going to talk about mandated boundaries, core practices, and voluntary practices. And I'm going to introduce a different way of looking at this versus the way that the book does, and I think it's going to add a lot of clarity. I think the way the book talks about this is confusing. I'm going to offer what I think and believe is a much less confusing way of talking about this. And then we're going to apply this in a couple of different contexts. The first, we're going to look at regulatory issues in the context of competition and antitrust. And I think I have a pretty good case here for an industry that left some money on the table because of what we identify in the middle layer of that pyramid. We're going to talk about the core practices, and why the threat of regulation can sometimes be enough to push folks in that direction. And then we're also going to talk about one of my favorite examples, something that's near and dear to me, which is companies trying to move up this pyramid as you go from non-discrimination to diversity to equity and inclusion, and how that's really the best thing for companies to push toward. So first, let's start with the theory, and again, the way that they discuss this in the book is really confusing. Read the book well enough to do well on the quiz. You know that the quiz is written by the textbook company, so it's going to be tethered to the textbook. So you are responsible for understanding what the book says on this, even though it is confusing. And I apologize that it is confusing, but your quizzes are any individual quiz is not that important a part of your grade. Any one quiz question is not that important a part of your overall semester grade. So hopefully, just don't get too wound up in it. But when you read this part of the book, and hopefully you all did, because remember now quizzes are due at 11 a.m. on Monday, which I think has been made clear to pretty much everyone. I expect many of you were like, what are they even talking about here? Because even as the professor, when I read it, I was like, what? Just don't get it. I think this is done poorly. So here's a different way of thinking about these concepts that I'm going to put out, which is a pyramid model, which starts at the bottom with mandated boundaries. The base of the pyramid that any company has to do is you have to obey the law. It's really that simple. You have to obey the law. If you are in a company, whether you've been there for 5 days or 5 years, I want you to look for, is your company obeying the law? And if you're not, I start working on your LinkedIn profile and your resume, because you got to get out of there. That is not a good place to work. So that's pretty straightforward, right? Like, obey the law. Don't do anything illegal. And don't do anything that's potentially illegal either. Like, if you find yourself as a company, as an executive, as a person within a company saying, well, the law is unclear here, I think we can get away with doing it. Stop right there. Be clearly above board, clearly and absolutely obey the law with no question or no doubts. That's the minimum that we expect from a company in this area. And then there's what I'm going to call the middle layer, which is core practices. And once you're obeying the law, then you have to ask, okay, what are our core practices in order to make sure that we are an ethical company, that we are perceived as an ethical company, that we're treating all our primary stakeholders in a fair way, that everyone is getting a fair shake from us, and that we're behaving in a way that everyone expects us to behave. To a large extent, these are your industry norms. These are your industry guidelines, industry practices. So what you're supposed to be doing in a restaurant, what you're supposed to be doing in an accounting firm, what you're supposed to be doing in a law firm. These are above and beyond what's required by law. There are just expectations, right? So for those of you who've ever hired a lawyer, if the lawyer is inflating their billing, because every time you email them and they send a 3-word response, they round up to 1/10 of an hour. And so every time you say, hey, did you get to this yet? And they say, yes, I did. And then they charge you for 6 minutes of their time and they start to inflate their billing that way. That's going to be really irritating, and you're going to be really upset with them. Now they're within their rights to do that. That's not an illegal practice, but it is a terrible practice. It's not a good way to run a law firm. And so a good law firm that has core practices that don't inflate their billing like that is going to be in a lot better shape. Or think about food service. I know a lot of you have worked in food service. It's an industry that, as a group, college students tend to work in. It's one I worked in high school and college. And think about the difference between what the city requires in terms of food safety and what your company actually should be doing. Your company should be so far and above what's required by law in terms of food safety that it's not even a doubt about whether you're going to pass a city inspection. It should be the case for any restaurant that a city inspector comes by without notice, and it's not a problem. They come, hey, anything you want to see. You want to look, from the stock room to the bathroom to the front room, whatever you want to see. I'll give you the tour, right? Because you should run a restaurant so thoroughly free and clear of any real danger to the customer in terms of food safety that you're not worried about anything the city might find. And then above and beyond the core practices of just making sure that you're running an ethical, above board company where everything's safe and everything's good, is what we might call voluntary practices, which is where a company really strives for excellence in terms of how they impact all of their stakeholders. At the top of the pyramid, I would say a company is really striving for excellence in how they impact all of their stakeholders. This would include, for instance, paying your employees above and beyond what the industry norm. In the context of food service, I would put, for instance, like if you run a restaurant that only uses fresh ingredients and only uses non-GMO ingredients, right? All of that's voluntary. You don't have to, you can use canned products, you can use frozen products, you can use GMO products. And there's not, they're your mainline standard fast food companies do a lot of that. And so there's a lot of room in a core practices area for using non-fresh GMO ingredients. But if you really want to stand out as like, listen, we really want to think about having good, close relationships with our local food supply chain. We want to think about having, something that's good for the environment, something that's good for our customers. Maybe only using like compostable packaging, these sorts of things where you're really going above and beyond and thinking about how are we really impacting with our shareholders? With our stakeholders. I may stop making that mistake someday. It'll probably be 3 semesters from now. But how do we go above and beyond such that we're really thinking about having a positive impact on all of our stakeholders? The community, right? So like charitable work, strategic charity with your local communities would go in here. No business has to give away money, right? In some ways that's antithetical to the business. But if you want to build a good relationship with your community, having strategic charitable relationships with various local organizations is a really good voluntary practice where companies can really start to strive for an even better role with those stakeholders, with the community. So at a minimum, companies have to obey the law. And when you stop obeying the law consistently, or when it stops even being clear that you're obeying the law, if it's unclear whether you're obeying the law or not, because there's some room for interpretation, and you start taking aggressive interpretations about what's legal, that's a serious danger sign. It's a serious danger sign. And if you see that at a company, I'm not kidding, get out. Look for your exit strategy right away if that looks like the company norm. But above and beyond that, these core practices are like a buffer between your company and legal trouble. So if you think about like, again, in the context of food safety, if we're not just sort of meeting the bare minimum that the city and state require for food safety, but we're really going above and beyond and making sure that none of our customers have even the slightest digestive upset because of the food that we ate, allergies notwithstanding, then we're not even worried about whether the city inspector comes in, right? If we're so if you're in the financial services and you're just so far above and beyond making sure that all of your clients are getting the very best from you, and you're absolutely putting their interests first, then it doesn't matter whether you're complying with the letter of the law, because of course you are. You're also complying with the spirit of the law, and you've got this nice thick buffer between you and potential legal troubles. And then above and beyond that, when you really start reaching for excellence and thinking about how do you voluntarily maximize your relationships with all of your stakeholders, that's where companies really reach that level of ethical excellence. And remember how that curve is shaped, right? Where when you really start to reach, exceed your legal minimum requirements, exceed what is the norm within the industry, and what's the norm within your core practices, to make sure that you're doing the right thing and really start to strive for excellence in how you treat all your stakeholders. Over time, that will make you more profitable than the mediocre companies or the least ethical companies. This up here is where that far end of that social responsibility scale hits, and that's where the extra return on assets really starts to kick in. Is this all relatively clear, I hope? Relatively clear? Hopefully clearer than the book. I did not find the book clear about this. So again, you're gonna have to read the book for the quiz, but I will test you on this, and I will not test you on what the book says. Okay, so what are our incentives for good core practices, right? Better legal compliance, easier legal outcomes, and better corporate culture. I want to talk about better legal compliance briefly. Like I said, if you have good core practices, then the question of whether you're meeting the letter of the law are going to get in legal hot water is just you can make it stop being an issue. You can make it stop being an issue, and that's exactly where you want to be. But then even if you do have negative legal outcomes, then the penalties are lower. The negative impact of legal outcomes are much lower. Now, the one area that the book does talk about that I think is really good that you should read about is the federal sentencing guidelines, right? The FSGO. Those they make it really explicit. If you as a company have really good, explicit ethical practices, if you have a hotline for potential whistleblowers to get in touch with, if you're constantly doing audits to look for problems within your company, and something happens to sneak through despite that, you're going to be in a really different legal position than if you're a company that's just trying to comply with the letter of the law. Right. So if company A goes above and beyond and has good core practices, has good ethical practices, has lots of layers of insulation between employees and illegal or unethical behavior, and company B just says, hey, here's the law, don't break it, then if an employee at company A and an employee at company B both break the same law in the same way, company B is going to be in a lot more hot water than company A, because the regulators are going to look at company A and say, hey, we're going to give you a break here because you were trying to stop behavior like this. And you literally had one rogue employee or a few rogue employees. We understand that sometimes happens, versus like your organization was kind of skating on the edge the whole time. You didn't really have an ethics office. You didn't really have compliance procedures. And so we're going to throw the book at you because you should have known better. You should have had more safeguards put in place. That's literally the way the FSGO is set up. That is literally the way the FSGO is set up, such that if companies that have more good core practices will get lighter sentences, they'll have smaller fines, they'll have smaller penalties attached to that than a company that doesn't have those good core practices. But it's not just the FSGO either. It's not just the federal law. At all levels, federal, state, local laws, these are all enforced by people. And people are going to take it easier on you if you're trying to do the right thing and something bad happens anyway. Right? It's like if you're drunk driving and you slam into somebody versus, or you're, which would be very bad, or you're looking at your phone and you slam into somebody, and which is still pretty bad. Like, the text can wait, people. Do not look at your phone while you're driving. And then, or, you just, the sun is in your eyes and you're otherwise being a good driver as much as you can, but you still slam into somebody. The courts are going to look at these in very different ways, as they should, even if the accident is the same. And the same is going to happen at all federal, state, and local enforcement. If your company is doing the right thing, if your company has good core practices, then any negative legal outcomes you have are going to be smaller if you have some rogue employees who go out and break the law anyway. So there are a couple areas where I want to apply this theory in helping you understand it. One is in the context of competition and antitrust. One is in the area of competition and antitrust. Now, there's a little bit of an aside I have here about antitrust, because I think this is important for us to, as for you as future business professionals, to understand that the historical model for regulating competition and fighting against trusts and concentrated economic power is a little bit outdated. And so I'm going to bring in some new ways of thinking about. There are some critiques about the standard way of thinking about antitrust, just because I think it's worth a little bit of a diversion in class here. But then we'll come back to an example that I have here, which really I think illustrates that sort of core practices level of the pyramid pretty well. Right. So first, the critique of antitrust, right, which is the traditional framework of market share, the traditional framework of antitrust, which centers around market share and some other things, is really a little bit limited. It starts with what's called the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, or the HHI. Just HHI will be sufficient for your notes. I will not ask you how to spell these folks' names on the exam. And the idea is that you take the square root of the market share of each firm and you add it up. So a 10% share, that's 10 times 10, that's 100. So one firm with a 10% share in one market adds 100 to the HHI for that market. And you add these together for all of the firms in a market until you get to the ones that are below 1%, so it's not adding anything. And the total will range from 1 to 10,000. Which would be like 1 would be like almost infinite competition, and 10,000 would be one firm has 100% of the share, and 100 times 100 is 10,000. So here's a hypothetical market. Again, I'll post the slide deck. You don't have to write out the whole table. But like, look at firm A here, 35%, 35 times 2 is 1225. Another firm has 20% of the share, that's 400. Right? Another firm has 10%, that adds 100. Another firm is 13%, that adds 169. And so what you get here is an HHI of 2036. So in this hypothetical, let's say for widgets, for this particular kind of widget, let's say that there are all these firms with these percentages, and so the HHI for that widget market would be 2036. And so where does that put them? That puts that market with 2036, that would put them in the area of moderate concentration. The HHI goes from 1 to 10,000, and anything above 1,500 is at least moderate concentration, and anything above 2,500 is really high concentration. And historically, what the Federal Trade Commission and the Justice Department have looked at is they've said, if a merger between two firms still keeps the industry down here, we don't care. If a merger between two firms moves them from here to here, we should at least review it. And if a merger moves them from here to here, or from low concentration to high concentration, then we really should review it with a heavy hand, ready to reject it if necessary. And the traditional framework looks at that as a problem because of pricing power. Right. And what we're looking to preserve is consumer welfare, especially pricing. So if I'm in the market for those widgets, then the firm that has 35% market share in that industry is going to have a little bit of capacity to put the price a little bit higher than it would be in a more fully competitive market. And so I, as the buyer of those widgets, I'm going to be in a bit of a pinch. Now, there are exceptions when you have, even if you only have two competitors, if it's a very small number of buyers as well, and those buyers are also very well informed, then sometimes those buyers can exert, at least have enough knowledge and enough control in the industry to kind of keep prices from getting too high. So the airplane market is a good example of this. It's really only Boeing and Airbus for full-size commercial aviation, but the airlines have some capacity to keep those prices from getting too high, even though it is a duopoly. But if there's, if it's two people, if there are only two grocery chains of any size in the whole Denver metro area, then we'd be paying a lot more for groceries, right? Because as consumers, what are we going to do? We're not, no individual consumer has enough buying power to. So at that point, they're just tacking on the higher and higher prices, because who else are we going to buy groceries from? And again, that the assumption is that this all happens within a single market. And so regulators are going to try to prevent mergers if it makes that market more concentrated, above and beyond sort of moderate or high concentration on the HHI. And sometimes they'll even break up firms if the firms have just gotten too big. Sometimes as well, regulators will go in and look for something called a consent decree. So you can, a regulator could go and say, we're not going to break you up, but you gotta use this formula to set your prices. We're not going to break you up, but you're not allowed to buy anybody else. You're not allowed to do any other mergers. We're not going to break you up, but you gotta engage in this and this and that behavior to sort of make the market look more like it would look in a competitive market. Right, but there are a lot of reasons to critique. There are a lot of reasons to critique this traditional antitrust framework. A lot of reasons that it just doesn't work as well as it used to. Right. The first is that markets are less walled off. It's less clear when one market begins and the other ends. Right. There's no longer just like a sugar market, or I mean, there is still like a sugar market or a gold market and a light sweet crude oil. Some of those commodities are still single markets, right? But so much of today's modern economy involves product lines that bleed together. Right. A great example of this is Google. Google is a dominant search provider. They're also a dominant online ad provider. Right. How do we separate those two? Right? Do we make, could the Department of Justice, when they're looking at Google, which I forget whether it's the FTC or Department of Justice, either of which can do antitrust enforcement, which of those is looking at Google? But when they're looking at Google, are they gonna say it's just the ads? It's just the search? It's both, right? Did Google, and in some ways you could say that, make a really good argument that Google took its dominance in search and leveraged that into a dominance in online advertising, which I think is a pretty easy argument to make, right? So how do we evaluate this when it's really dominant in two highly related areas? Also, pricing is no longer the only potential impact on consumers. So much of antitrust is focused on, like, what are you doing for consumer prices? So like I was shocked when 5 different publishers got together with Apple and set rates for ebooks. And I wasn't shocked when that happened, but I was shocked when the feds gave a stinking care about it at all, because what is Apple's share of the book market? Right? What is Apple's share of the book market, and if the price is the problem with the book market, the ebook market, the problem with the ebook market isn't that consumers are paying too much. It's that there aren't enough buyers for those digital books at the wholesale level to then turn around and sell them to consumers. So in other words, the ebook market doesn't have a consumer welfare problem. It has an Amazon problem. And Amazon is driving a lot of those publishers out of business, right? And so if the publishers want to get together with Apple and say, well, at least on this platform, maybe we can get 10% more or 20% more, which better reflects our costs and gives us the capacity to have some more profit and hire more staff and recruit better writers and better support our industry, right? That is in some ways a harm to consumers in the short term because pricing goes up. Maybe a benefit to consumers in the long term because there's a more vibrant, more healthier ebook market. But that lack of pricing. Pricing is no longer the only way to evaluate the potential impact on consumers. Think about other services that are just free. They're just free for consumers. Right. And so the fact that Google has a dominant share of the email market, that could be bad for consumers in a way that doesn't affect pricing at all. That could be bad for consumers in a way that doesn't affect pricing at all. I mean, if Google's privacy practices, if Google's information management practices, if Google has other sort of ethical issues that relate to the way that they use Gmail, maybe that's harming consumers in a way that doesn't affect pricing because email is free to them. Or are we only concerned about the consumers who are paying? And so is Google's dominance of search only a problem for the people who have to pay for advertising on search? And then for the rest of us, it doesn't, the welfare of consumers doesn't matter. These are weird, hard things to think about with this stuff. Sometimes the problem is monopsony, not monopoly. Anybody remember from econ? I don't even know if your econ classes would have covered this, but anybody know what monopsony means? Simonis.
Here we go. Sorry. Took me a second to unmute. Monopsony is when firm is the only employer. So it's the only player in the labor market.
Sure. So labor is a subset of the type of product that you could have a monopsony for, right? So, but monopsony is a dominant buyer instead of a dominant seller, right? And so like if you're in a town with really one dominant employer, then that employer has a monopsony on labor in that town, right? But labor is just one product that you can have a monopsony over. A Walmart up here is a clue because it is a clue about where that happens in goods as well, right? So like if you're selling diapers or toilet paper or televisions, right? Walmart is going to come to you and get that margin down so low that you're barely making any profit, and then they're going to push you down further, and then they're going to push you down further in terms of what price you're paying. And they can do that because of the dominant position they have for so many of the products that they carry in the store as a buyer, not the only buyer, right? It's more like an oligopsony, which is, now we're getting too crazy. But Walmart and Amazon have so much pricing power over their suppliers because they buy so much stuff, and they represent such a substantial share of that market but the antitrust traditionally doesn't look at this regulatory this as a potential option for regulation very often at all, because it doesn't. Like the benefit to us as consumers, I walk in that door, I'm saving money. Walmart is still making a real nice profit on it, but the benefit to the effect to the consumers is a benefit, not a harm. So like does the harm for suppliers and the Walmart taking the vast lion's share of the profits in all of those different transactions, does that count as a harm to the economy that regulators should look at? I don't know. I think that's all really important. I think those are all really important questions for antitrust. That's a sort of critique that's a little bit of a setup for what I'm going to talk about, but I think also just worth mentioning generally if we're going to talk about antitrust enforcement. But I want to talk about an example that is a much more niche form of regulation that is also kind of an antitrust type enforcement, which also illustrates some of these things, right? Which is network neutrality. Sorry, that tea is really hot. Take the lid off. Let that cool down for a little bit here. So network neutrality is a debate about whether the people who manage the stuff on the bottom half of this stack should be fair in how they treat different content at the top of this stack, right? So the lower layers, think about everything from, especially like the network and the data link layer. This is the stuff from your router back. And then up above, in particular, like the application and presentation layer, this is what we think of as the internet. This is the content. These are your cat memes. This is Zoom. This is Instagram. This is your map on your phone. All of this stuff that happens at the application layer. The folks down here in the network layer, and I'm going to be a little bit more specific here, your internet service providers, they were looking at all of this money being made out here and saying, God, that stuff is just growing like gangbusters. at the start of the century, they were looking at this stuff saying, man, there's so much money being made here. And every month we're just still getting our same, 30, 40, $50 a person per subscriber here. And we can raise that a little bit, but it's not, there's just no way that we're going to be the kind of, that we're going to enjoy the kind of explosive growth that some of these companies are enjoying down here. I mean, like in 2005 Comcast versus 2021 Comcast is still kind of the same company. Think about how different YouTube is versus 2005 today. Like that's not even the same. It's not even the same. I mean, we're talking about exponential, like logarithmic, just explosive growth, right? MySpace back then, and then Facebook, right? Just explosive growth, just tremendous value being generated. And so the ISP started to look at this and started to look at all this stuff out there that they're delivering you to and saying, hey, we are in a unique position. There are cable companies and there are phone companies, and that's about it. There are cable companies and there are phone companies, and that's about it. Now that puts them in the internet service provider market. This right here is a lot of this stuff, like YouTube for the online video hosting is a very dominant provider. But there is at least theoretical competition, and in some ways meaningful competition, because you can host your stuff at a different video site and you can go look at stuff at a different video site. In fact, there's a whole genre of video sites that are also important on the internet that many of you use on a regular basis when no one's looking, and that's fine too, right? But the YouTube is not, and YouTube is not interested in that segment. But the YouTube is a dominant provider, but it is at least theoretically can be competed against. There's not even theoretical competition against your wireline cable to your house ISPs. It's hard to even theorize what that's going to look like and how we're going to get there. I mean, maybe 5G, maybe this low Earth satellite cockamamie scheme that Elon Musk has cooking. I'll believe that is good and competitive when I see it. I'd love for it to be. I hope to be wrong. I'm skeptical. But the at least for now, and starting in 2000, the ISPs were like, oh, we're going to face so much competition. There's going to be so much competition. They've been saying this for 20 years, and it keeps not happening, right? Because right now, to get broadband to your house, I got to have a cable running to your house. That means I got to dig a trench or run across a phone line to get to your house, and that is incredibly expensive. Especially the digging part. I mean, there's a problem in economic, which is some markets are really not competitive because they have high sunk costs. So imagine and think about what that means in this context. If I wanted to, so I'm in Wash Park. Imagine I want to start the Wash Park ISP. So I rent a big fat trunk to some big loop out here, some 10 terabyte connection that's running through the neighborhood or just down the highway or something. That wouldn't be that hard. Getting access to one of those. There are enough of those competitors running, the giant fat pipes that'll run to like whoever MSU Denver gets our entire internet connection from. Like if you have, if you're talking about a $20,000 a month connection, there are a whole bunch of folks who will do that competitively, because that kind of money starts to make it worth digging a big trench. Right. But if you're, if Simonis and Wendy and Sunday are all in Wash Park, and I'm like, okay, you're going to be my first 3 ISP customers, and Wendy's over here, and Simonis is 8 blocks that way, and Sunday is 10 blocks that way. Well, now to get those 3 competitors, I got to dig a trench that's 3 blocks this way, 8 blocks that way, and 10 blocks that way. Right. And so why in the world am I going to start a business that has that kind of upfront costs? Unless I already have the cable in the ground to start with. Unless I already have a substantial portion of that infrastructure investment already made. And so phone companies already had the cable running to your house. Cable companies already had the cable running to your house. And guess who competes in the ISP market? That's it. And so they're like, well, we're in this really dominant position. Nobody else is going to get you to the internet. And so we want some of the big explosive profits that are happening here. And so starting in about 2005, the executives from some of these ISPs started saying stuff like, I'm going to charge these different services charge you to get access to these different services, right? So I'm going to go to Google and Yahoo and Flickr and Blogger and Bing and say, hey, either you can pay us directly or we're going to go to the consumers and charge them $5 to be able to access the content in this Pathfinder tier. I'm going to, we have a lot of international folks in the US who want to be able to look at content online, online content like Baidu and the BBC and India Times. And so we're going to put a $5 surcharge on that and get some get some of that explosive revenue that these internet companies are enjoying, right? Or, Amazon can afford it. So we're going to go to Amazon and say, hey, pay us some money, pay us the ISP some money to get on this preferred tier, or we're going to stick you in this tier that not a lot of people are going to buy because they're not going to want to pay that $5 to be able to do online shopping. And so the idea was that the telcos were going to go to these companies and say, either you pay us or we're going to make the consumers pay us. And we want a chunk of that explosive revenue that you're getting in that all those competitive internet spaces. Right. And this isn't a hypothetical. This isn't a hypothetical. They might do this. They literally started saying, we're going to do this. So like Ed Whittaker, who was the CEO of what would then become the new AT&T, said, customers got, cable companies and they got phone companies. That's it. What are they going to do? Where are they going to go? Where are they going to go? And these other firms that are making all this money on my back, I want some of that. Well, they're not making money on his back. He's providing a service. They're providing a service. They're complementary services. Saying they're making money on my back was not fair. The only reason he could say that was because he was in a duopoly position. So what happened? What happened? Why didn't this come to fruition? I mean, this was threatened 15 years ago. So why didn't this happen? Well, what happened is nerds like me started doing things like writing journal articles. I wrote one of the earlier journal articles calling for net neutrality. It's in the Federal Communication Law Journal if anyone wants to see it, from 2006. And I'm in really good company. I mean, there were hundreds of us who wrote articles calling for net neutrality. I thought without a policy requiring that ISPs treat all of this content fairly, not discriminate, not charge these companies extra, not charge you extra for this content versus that content. Just treat this content fairly. And sometimes, handling this type of video content versus text content versus emails, right? Handling them a little bit differently can make sense, because like what we're doing right now, this has to be real-time live. If it's not real-time live, we got problems, right? Whereas email, if my email gets delayed 3 seconds, 10 seconds, I don't even notice. If this gets delayed 10 seconds, we got problems. But treat anything, that is important, that it has to be treated live, should be treated fairly. Anything that can be delayed a little bit should be treated fairly, right? I can't, all of this stuff should be treated equitably by these ISPs. And I honestly thought that if we didn't require it by law, that we were going to lose what we now know is the open internet, right? Especially when companies are threatening stuff like this. But what happened is the threat of regulation and the threat of bad press was probably enough to keep internet service providers from doing everything that they could do under the law. There was nothing in 2006. There was nothing illegal about this business model. And the net neutrality regulations that the Obama administration eventually passed under the FCC didn't come until almost the end of his second term. So you've got a decade almost of them being able to plot this and deploy it and make that kind of money. But they didn't, I think it's because just the threat of regulation was enough to push those companies from the bottom of that pyramid, minimum legal compliance, up into thinking more about what are the best practices for our industry and how should we stick those out. So their core practices were actually probably in their better interests. The core practices were actually probably in their better interest, because they instead of just obeying the law and then maximizing short-term revenue, because in the long term, if regulators see this and jump in and start regulating, who's to stop them from requiring broadband companies from leasing out their lines to competitors as well, right? And so there are a lot of countries, like in the UK, you are required to lease out here. In the UK, you're required to lease out this infrastructure to competitors. So this line, you can, I don't have to dig a trench to Wendy's house. I don't have to dig a trench to Logan's house, right? I just rent the line that already goes there. because by law, the person who owes that line has to rent it to me. Right. So because those regulatory, and then imagine what that does to Comcast's bottom line, right? Instead of getting $40, $50, $60 from each of you, they're getting $5 because that's all they get to charge for the line rental. And then this other company is getting all that money. And some of them are going to do it for $15. Some of them are going to do it for $20. And so maybe we have a much more competitive marketplace because there's a lot more competition forced by law over this last mile that connects to your house. So that's the last thing ISPs wanted. They said, you know what? We've got a pretty cushy duopoly business model right now. If we stay in this lane, if we just stay in this lane and raise our prices, a good bit, but just keep the duopoly that we have, then we don't need this. We don't need to take the gamble on this. If we stick with the core practices of just being ISPs and not trying to get away with everything we can under the law, then we're probably in better shape in the long term. And I think that's probably the right calculus. I think that's probably the right decision that they came to. And they continue to make tremendous profits on delivering broadband to the home consumer. It's not as much when you don't get the triple play from them, right? Like, how many of you also pay for cable television? Right. I see a few affirmatively shaking their heads. I've got 7 people on my screen, and nobody is raising their hand, and nobody in the chat is saying hi, right? Because at your age, no, why bother for cable television? I mean, now you're probably paying for a combination of like Hulu, probably on the cheap plan with commercials, which is a great deal. Netflix. I love Netflix. Was just watching Netflix a little bit as I ate lunch, right? So HBO Now, maybe if you've got your parents' password, you've got all these different services. So you're kind of buying cable back a little bit at a time anyway. So the people who provide the televisual content are getting back into your wallet a little bit at a time. And so the ISPs are cranky because they're losing out on that. But in the long term, it'll just be, you'll pay, almost as much as you did for a triple play just for your broadband. And then you'll pay that money separately for all the different bundles of content that you want. And they'll still make basically the same profit. That's a pretty good business model. So they should just stick with it. So by not being as aggressive as they could and pushing as far as they could with what the law would give them, by instead sticking with a different set of core practices, I think they set themselves up for more profits in the longer term. Does that make sense? Okay. So another example that illustrates this, in my view, is diversity and inclusion. And for those of you who've not read The Inclusion Dividend by Mark Kaplan and Mason Donovan, it's a great book. I think it's fantastic. For those of you who want to go into human resource management or just want to be a sort of leader of teams generally, this is a huge book. This is a great book. Or something like this. They're more like it, that some understanding of why diversity is good and why it helps a company get what it wants, that is really helpful. And I want to take the diversity and inclusion discussion and reframe it a little bit, just like I did with antitrust, because I think that there's a better and more sophisticated way to look at this that in a lot of ways is more accurate, right? So we often start with what I would call the individual frame and the ethical frame. The individual frame and the ethical frame when we think about diversity. First, our goal is just to have a diverse workforce within our company, right? So each individual brings whatever specific, elements of diversity that they bring to the company, your racial background, your ethnic background, your gender, your age, your ability, or whatever disabilities you bring, your veteran status, whether you were born in the US or moved here, right? So each individual just brings some element of diversity to the workforce. And then it's up to all of us as individuals to fight our individual bias. A little bit about me. I am Hispanic ethnically. I was born to a mother who's Mexican and a father who's half Portuguese. I don't read as Hispanic, and I was adopted as an infant and raised by some very white people. And so I read white. I come off as white. And in every way I've if I'm honest with myself, I've benefited just in like little ways, but like thousands of times from looking like the type of thing that I wanted to be. I looked like a grad student, and so it made it easier for me to get into grad school. I looked like a professor, and so it was easier to convince people that they should hire me as a professor. If I'm honest with myself, there's been a little bit of a wind at my back because as a cisgendered white man, right? I just look and sound a little bit more, not night and day, not night and day. I still had to do the work. I still had to read the books. I still had to write the articles, write a book, write a dissertation. I still had to do all the things, but I've benefited from looking a little bit more like your mental model of a professor. Right. And so the individual frame is, let's set that aside. Let's set that aside and look for instances of individual bias. So we had a senior vice president. The first time I met him was in an elevator over in SSB. And he's a very low-key guy, does not dress like this at all, was wearing a backpack, had long hair pulled back, is a really sort of, like, until he starts talking, comes off as a very, very diminutive guy. And I thought I was in a conversation with a bunch of other administrators that I knew, and I thought that he was one of our students, right? Because he's got a backpack, he's not dressed like this, he doesn't look like me, he doesn't sound like me. I brought that individual bias to that interaction. Turns out he's like a new senior vice president, right? And so so fighting those instances of individual bias, right? And it probably helped that impression of mine, if I'm being candid, that he reads as Hispanic, right? Fighting those instances of individual bias is our obligation, and that's what this story is about. Now, I'm not saying that that's not true. That is 100% true. I have to fight those instances of individual bias myself, and I urge you all to do the same, right? But that frame is really limited, and I don't think that that's enough. We'll get there. Right. And so we're trying to push individuals to do the right thing and catch themselves. And we're doing it because it's the right thing, because it's morally correct, because it's ethically correct. And as an example of this framework, which is a good framework, which is, I think, entirely worth learning and worth adopting and worth learning more about, is the show Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man on YouTube. Right. So I strongly recommend this. It's pretty good. This link right here is this link here is great. The show is great. He brings in some really A-list people, including Matthew McConaughey, to have some really good conversations. I think it's fantastic. I think it's good stuff. But I don't think that's enough. And I want to look more at, although before we even move on, it's about addressing white fragility. Right? It's about building more flexibility, becoming more culturally nimble. Right? Looking at someone who might not meet our mental model of a senior vice president and not automatically assuming, oh, hey, that must be one of our non-traditional students. Instead saying, I don't know who this person is. Right? Being more flexible and asking a question like, hey, how are you doing? Nice to meet you. What's going on? Instead of, because I could have reached out a paw too and said hi, and I did not. Right. And in addition to that, not instead of, but in addition to that, I also want you to think about the systemic model and the business model. I want you to think about these issues systemically instead of just individually. And I want you to think about what is our business model? Right. And how does that affect our business model? Because I think that this is a more advanced way to look at this. You kind of have to have the stuff on the left down. But I think the more sophisticated way to look at it is the stuff on the right, right? Instead of merely diversity, companies should think about inclusion, right? Instead of just who's in the building, we should be asking who feels like part of the team. Who feels like they can bring their full selves to work? Right. So one very small example of this is in my slide decks. I try to include, for every single picture, I try to include an alt text description for all of my pictures in my slide deck. so that those who have limited visual ability can see in the form of the alt text description what's going on with those images. Now, that's something that the accessibility office could get involved in. That student could also just email me and say, hey, Professor Herman, could you add alt text to your images? Because otherwise I don't know what's going on with those. And so the slide decks are just less valuable to me, right? But if they have to ask those things, they don't feel as naturally part of the class. They don't feel as naturally as part of the class. And so if I include that proactively, that's a very small, and it's once you learn how to do it in PowerPoint, it's super easy. It's ridiculously, it takes me an extra like 3 minutes, right? So and I don't mean per image, I mean per slide deck. It's wicked fast. PowerPoint made it really easy. So by doing that, I make folks who have different levels of vision feel included without having to ask for it, right? I just want that to feel as natural and complete as possible, and so that they can really bring their full selves to class. That's the tiniest example. That's the tiny, but every time you have a culture where that stuff like that is the norm, right? Where you don't have to, like we never have what are called standing meetings. You ever heard of this, right? For 15 minutes, they're supposed to be 15, 20 minutes, and you stand to disincentivize sort of having longer meetings. That assumes things about people which may not be true. That assumes things about people which may not be fair. And then that, the person can either sort of like struggle through, even if they, they have limited ability to stand, or they can just go and sit anyway and dare someone to talk to them, or they have to go talk to the supervisor who called the meeting, or they have to go talk to HR, and then it's a whole mess, right? So by doing things that are uninclusive, right, we unintentionally make it so that people can't bring their full selves to the office. And the less we do that, the more people feel like they can bring their full selves to the office. We also have to fight, so in addition to individual bias, we also have to fight systemic bias. The tech sector right now is going through this in a big way, where the colleges that they recruit from for talent, very white colleges, and they don't make any effort to recruit from HBCUs or Hispanic serving institutions, right? So like, yeah, you're going to wind up with a much wider workforce that way. And that's going to be if you just prioritize recruiting from schools that tend to have really white graduates, you're going to have a systemically biased workforce. And so you have to build in systemic anti-bias to fight this stuff. That includes stuff like having HR say you have to have a certain share of folks who are, who meet certain diversity goals in your hiring pool before you can proceed to bringing in finalists. And you have to have a certain amount of diversity within your finalist pool before you can make a hire, right? And if you say, oh, I don't know where to find those people, we'll build in the systems that find those people out in the world. And then if there really is a legitimate talent pool problem, right, talent pipeline problem, and there is in technology, the talent pipeline in STEM is not diverse, right? Then in addition to those core practices in the middle of that pyramid, go above and beyond at the top of that pyramid and say, we're going to fund the heck out of HSIs, out of HBCUs. We're going to fund the heck out of, STEM scholarships at traditional schools, right? So that we can, bend that hanger back and have more, try to set it so we're systemically having a more diverse pipeline in the technology world. Now, it's also important to highlight that we're not doing this just because it's the right thing to do, but also because it's more profitable. And I can't sing this song loud enough. Right? That's what the inclusion dividend talks about, and it explains why that happens. But in terms of that it happens, that this is a result, here's some pretty good evidence from the radical leftists at Checks Notes, Kinsey and Company. Right? So like mainstream, top of the line consultants who are just interested in making more money. Right? They have concluded that good D&I strategy pays. That it pays to have good diversity and inclusive strategy, right? Here's just one example of this. This is from a report they did in 2018. Here's the bottom quartile and the top quartile for gender diversity among the executive team, right? And this is the odds of outperforming your industry median for profitability. So companies that have the bottom quarter of companies for gender diversity only have a 45% chance of outperforming their sector. And companies in the top quarter for gender diversity have a 55% chance of outperforming their sector, right? So less than even money and better than even money, that you're going to outperform your peers based on this variable alone of gender diversity among your executive team. Same thing with racial and ethnic diversity. And here the numbers are even a little bit different. 10-point advantage, 15-point advantage, right? For companies that have more diversity among the executive team, do better for seeing around corners, do better for speaking the language of the entire population when it comes time to go to market, and lots of other things, and therefore perform better in the market. How does this happen, though? What's the mechanism that leads us from more diversity and inclusion to more profits? First, reduce compliance costs and PR headaches, right? The background image is a good hint. Anybody know this gentleman's name?
Is he the previous CEO of Uber?
Yes, Travis Kalanick. Travis Kalanick. Right. So a blog post by engineer Susan Fowler a couple years ago detailed sexual harassment and no response by HR. She's calling HR is like, I'm being sexually harassed. It's a rampant problem, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Uber did nothing about it. Then that March, it comes out that 5 executives, including Kalanick, had attended a brothel in Seoul during a work trip. I have no judgment about whether you're going to do that. Sex work is work. I'm cool with that. I have no judgment. But on a work trip, no, do not. Right. A female employee with the group complained at the time. Nothing happened. 2 Junes ago now, 2019, many reports of executives mishandling its response to the brutal 2014 rape by an Uber driver in India. Also that June, an independent investigation by former Attorney General Eric Holder recommended, among other things, quote, limiting the alcohol budget, developing clear guidance on workplace relationships, and effectively handling complaints. I mean, this is basic, like, crawl before you can walk HR stuff, and they just hadn't even done that stuff. Also that June, during a company-wide meeting to address the company's sexual harassment crisis, one of the board members made a sexist comment on the call. Right? So how has this impacted Uber's profit margins? Well, it's made people a little bit less likely to choose them when there are competitors. I don't even have to mention their major competitor's name when I tell you I choose that other competitor on a consistent basis because I don't want to give this guy my money. Right now, it doesn't take, it takes a pretty small share of the public deciding that before you're losing enough money that it's worth, I don't know, maybe not just letting people be drunken, misogynistic jerks at work. So I'm in the minority, but I'm absolutely good company. I've talked to a lot of people among the folks who are their prime demographic of their customers, who also are just like, nah, I don't support Uber. Another benefit of good D&I practice is a better talent management. Better talent management here. There's a lot of factors here: more innovation, a better employee morale, more functional communication, a broader base for nurturing managers and executives. Right? If everyone who walks in the door as a frontline employee has the chance to rise to leadership based on excellence, because everyone feels included, because everyone is treated, even if they don't meet the mental model of like, oh, that looks like a C-suite executive, right? But you're harvesting them because they might be a C-suite executive, then you have a broader, potentially more talented group of people to choose from. There's another, as part of managing talent here, as part of managing your talent, one important element I want to highlight is something called psychological safety. Psychological safety is an individual's perception of the consequences of taking an interpersonal risk, or a belief that a team is safe for risk taking in the face of being seen as ignorant, incompetent, negative, or disruptive. In a team with high psychological safety, teammates feel safe to take risks around their team members. They feel confident that no one on the team will embarrass or punish anyone else for admitting a mistake, asking a question, or offering a new idea. And when everyone feels like when no one on the team feels like the team will neglect, undervalue, or misunderstand them simply for being themselves because they have a slightly different accent, they have a different dialect, they sit differently, they're of a different generation, they've had different life experiences. When all of that is valued rather than devalued, right? When looking a certain way, sounding a certain way, having a certain background is not taken as the norm, but is just taken as one of any of all of which are valid ways of having lived your life and having been until you got to that room, then you're just going to get a lot more. You're just going to get a lot more quality out of those employees. You're going to get a lot more risk, a lot more bold ideas put forward, and some of those are going to be good. And some of those are going to be the hot new idea that takes you forward in a way that lets you outclass your competitors. And cutting the other direction, covering comes with costs. What do we mean by covering? I mean, feeling like I can't bring my full self to work. I've got to come in every day trying to look like this, trying to sound like this, trying to dress like this. And I mean me, Bell Herman specifically. Right? If everyone who doesn't look like me or sound like me or dress like me feels like they have to come in and look and sound and dress like me every day, right? Then they're covering. They're covering. If you worry that I'm going to police your hairstyle, and so you wear a different hairstyle than you'd really like to wear. If you feel like I'm going to police your language, and so you're constantly thinking about like, oh, am I phrasing this the right way, or am I saying this the right way, right? Then that all comes with a cost. That all comes with a cost, right? It's like it's the difference between trying to talk to someone with your phone away and trying to talk to someone while you're browsing Twitter. Right? That extra mental bandwidth takes away from the conversation. And the more we cover, the less innovative we are. The higher our morale, the less functional our community. And the less functional our communication, the harder it is for us to look like future managers and executives. So again, you're missing out on that potential future leadership talent as well. So that's all on the talent management side. And let's talk about the talent acquisition side. Before we talk about my example, I want to talk about the talent management and the talent acquisition side here at MSU Denver. Because I think that we as an institution, for our staff and faculty, do about as well as I've ever seen in terms of having an inclusive workplace. I feel like people more than any, I've worked at a lot of universities, and I know people at probably thousands of universities around the world. And so I've talked to a lot of people about their workplaces on this count a lot, because this is something that I'm passionately interested in and constantly talking to people about. And a lot of my friends who are faculty at other schools are passionately interested in talking about, not least because they don't all bring this to work, right? So I know where we stand on this count. And we are about as good at this as any college or university that I know of. That's not to say that we're perfect. We are not perfect. We could do better. We could do a lot better. But relative to our other peers, I think we're doing a lot better already. And I go to AACSB conferences that talk about diversity and inclusion, and so many of them are like, I have no idea how to get a more diverse faculty. I have no idea how to get a more diverse leadership. And you look around the fifth floor of admin. Look at our leadership at MSU Denver. We're doing a lot better than a lot of our peers on those counts, right? And a lot of it is just because we have an inclusive environment. We have an inclusive environment that lets people be themselves, that lets people bring their full selves to work. And that is very much, that's not just what we say, that's what we do and how we live on a day-to-day basis. And so I'm not going to lie, we underpay. We pay less than our competitors almost up and down the entire food chain. Almost up and down the entire org chart, we are paying less than other schools. Sometimes our closest competitor, the other university on our campus, is paying better than us. And folks are choosing to start with us and choosing to stay with us and leaving money on the table because they feel like they can bring their full selves to work. And we're bringing bold ideas and interesting ideas and outclass. I mean, like we have the best, most highly, at least the most highly accredited CIS program in the state, bar none. Bar none. We are the only CIS program in the state that is accredited by both AACSB and by ABET, which is an engineering accrediting agency. The only one. There's one in the state. It's us. Right. And we also have far and away the most diverse CIS department I've ever seen. Right. And our faculty, any one of our faculty could leave that department and go work somewhere else, still in Colorado, within a few years, not necessarily any given year, faculty move slowly, but could go work somewhere else in Colorado because CIS faculty are in demand and they can make much more money working somewhere else. And they stay with us because they feel like they can bring their full selves to work in a way that they can't do at other campuses. Right. I think that that's a huge factor in our success as an institution, because we get something like 60 or 65 cents on the dollar per student relative to some other universities in the state in terms of state funding. Our tuition, as you know, is the cheapest, right? Like and so we just don't have the money to pay people, but they stay and they work and they give really thoughtful, innovative, hard days of work day in and day out because they feel like they can bring their full selves to work. So whenever somebody is like, hey, what do you think about working at MSU Denver? I'm like, do it. Come here because it's awesome. Come here because it's awesome. And I can recommend it unconditionally. Now you could go the other way. You could have more of a fast food kind of paradigm, right? Pay nothing, not make anyone feel especially welcome, not have it, but think about how long the typical fast food workers last on the job and why that is. Right. It's not just the pay. It's not just the repetitive work. It's because for the most part, they don't feel valued. For the most part, fast food workers do not feel especially valued. Now, there are exceptions to this. In-N-Out was rated as like the number 2 or number 3 best place to work recently. So it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be this way. Starbucks has pretty good employee loyalty because those employees, more than other fast food joints, not relative to not relative to Boeing, right? But relative to the industry, employees at Starbucks feel pretty valued. So now obviously there's the pay, there's the benefits, there's the work environment, there's all that stuff. But within that, all things being equal, you're going to have a better chance attracting top talent if you have a diverse and inclusive workplace there already. There's another benefit here that I think is often undervalued, that people often don't think about until they show up for a sales call and they realize what a poor match they are for their client base, right? Think about showing up like this to go sell a fancy new product to for somebody who's maybe going to cut you a 6, 7, 8 figure check, and you bring this team to the sales meeting, right? I mean, if everyone else on the other side of the table also looks like this, maybe it doesn't stick out. But the odds of that are lower and lower every year. The odds of that are lower and lower every year. And so if you're going to show up like this, you might as well dress like this because you seem like you're out of this era. You seem like you're out of this era. But that's not just from this era. I just did a search for sales team in the modern era in photos, and this is one that I found. Right? Still not that diverse. Now, if you're trying to sell, something highly technical where you're only, you're in a segment where there's a highly informed consumer who's only interested in features and drawbacks and limitations and cost in terms of the contract, and it's a highly technical thing. Maybe this is okay. Maybe you get away with this. But if you show up trying to make a sale where there's any expectation that there's some sort of like human understanding of like, I really get you, and me really getting you is an important part of what's going to happen in this contract, and you show up like this, and the folks on the other side of the table don't look like this, it's going to be a harder pitch every year. It's going to be a harder pitch every year. And because your competitors probably have a more diverse sales team. And so the more you can bring folks who understand, the more you can bring folks who understand and who just signal understand by virtue of being a representative group of people to meet with clients, the more clients you're going to be able to sell to, the broader your market is, and therefore the more profit you can make. It's a subtle thing, and it's not, it doesn't always mean the death knell just because, you've got largely white men selling products, but it's a harder and harder message to say of like, don't worry, I get you, I understand. I mean, like, imagine trying to sell, trying to sell a wide range of personal care products. Right. And you're trying to set, you're an advertising firm and you show up ready to meet with folks. You're trying to sell a wide range of trying to advertise a wide range of personal care products. And you show up with a team like this. Right. Do you really understand the whole personal care market? Because I'm not sure you do. So that's again, marketplace engagement is another huge area of potential room for when you have a more diverse and inclusive force. There are two great TED Talks here. Rocio Lorenzo has one called How Diversity Makes Teams More Innovative. There's a link for that. There's another one by Janet Stovall, How to Get Serious About Diversity and Inclusion in the Workplace. I've got that link here. I recommend them both. And I think that's my last slide. Let me see here. Yes, it is. So, which is a good thing because we're just about out of time. I've got a minute for questions if anyone wants to ask. Otherwise, if you want to talk about your situation, office hours are right after this as well.
I have a question. Are we doing the discussion in class Wednesday? Or should we just turn in for today?
No, we're back to doing Monday, Wednesday, like we were at the start of the semester, and that's going to be unless I get a killer guest speaker who can knock us off that path, which I'm trying to do. I'm working with the C2 Hub to make that happen. But for now, we're back to Monday lecture, Wednesday discussion.
Okay, just because the discussion's due tonight, that's why I was wondering.
I think that
for chapter 3.
Yeah, for chapter 3, yeah, no, but this is chapter 4, so we'll discuss chapter 4 on Wednesday.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, and sorry, I've not entered chapter 3 discussions in the gradebook. I should probably do that now, so you all get confirmation that that's done.
Okay, thank you.
From class last time, yes.